We can edit keys even further by using the dope sheet and the curve editor. So let's take a look at the scene that we just created here. So I have this airplane basically flying through the scene. If I left click on it, you'll see that we have all of these keys in the timeline. Now, if I want to, I can edit in the timeline, as we've seen. But if I want deeper and more fine control, I'll have to go into one of two editors, the dope sheet and the curve editor. Now I'm going to go ahead and just go into a 4 view so we can see our animation when I have this open. So I'm going to go into my graph editors, and let's start off with the dope sheet. So the dope sheet is kind of just a big brother of what we see on the timeline. If I scroll down here, you'll see that I've got keys for just about anything I want in the scene. So if I have environment keyframes or materials or whatever, those will all show up. And down here towards the bottom are the actual objects in my scene. So if I click on rocket plane here, notice how these keys here match these keys in my timeline. So even the colors match. So this one is red, green, and blue. This one's just green. This one's red and green, and so on. Now if I hit this plus sign here, you'll see that I can expand this. I can dive a little bit deeper. So now I can see that these are all transform keys. If I go one level deeper, you can see that I have position keys here and rotation keys here. So I can go through and actually move those keys separately. So if I were to, for example, select this middle key for position, left click and drag and move it, notice how it's also showing up on the timeline. So now this key here is separate from this one. So my translation is a little bit before the rotation key. And if I want to, I can select that rotation key and move that around in this dope sheet. And again, I can move them so that they're together and stacked. And I can move them also on the timeline. Now we can dive even deeper than that. So if I go one level deeper into rotation and translation, you can see that I have separate keys for X, Y, and Z on both of these. So that allows me to control how the rotation happens along each axis. So as you can see, we can dig down very discreetly and get very fine control over each key. Now if we want even further control, we can go into the curve editor. So right now we're in dope sheet, but we can go into the curve editor here. Or if we go into graph editors, we can also just select curve editor. Now you'll notice that this interface is pretty similar to what we saw before in the dope sheet, except the blocks have now been replaced with curves. So these curves actually show how the system is in-betweening the animation. So now we have two other curves in addition to this. We have the Y position, which is the back and forth. We also have the Z position, which is up and down. So you can see that as this object moves up, this Z goes up just slightly. Now if I wanted to, I could select this key and move that object up or down. So all I have to do is left click and drag, and I can push that object up a little bit higher. And so now when it goes up a little bit higher than it did before. Now I can also adjust these curves by selecting these handles. So if I wanted to kind of gradually come up to the curve, I can adjust this left or right to reshape these curves. So now it'll kind of go up slowly and then kind of come down a little bit more quickly. Now we can also change the type of curve that we have here. Now this is very similar to these tangents here. We have these which set the initial tangent of the curve, but we can always go back and change that later. So if I go into my X position here, you'll notice that I'm getting what's called a slow out. So it's slowing into this motion, and then when it gets to the end, it automatically slows out again. Well, I want this airplane to actually be traveling at a constant rate of speed, so I don't want it to slow into this motion. So I can select this key, and if I right click, you'll see that we have a couple of different options here. We have auto key, we have spline, we have linear and step. Now, by default, we have spline, but if we go to linear, watch what happens. This automatically changes that curve so it's a straight line. So now it looks like the airplane has already been traveling at a constant rate of speed. Now here you can see it's slowing in, but if I select this key and right click, set it to linear, it will now come into that at a constant rate of speed, at least in the X direction. Now we have other types of keys we can do as well. So this key, for example, is a Bezier curve. Now if I open this window up just a little bit more, you'll see that we have a number of standard tangents. So in this case, we can set our tangents to auto, to spline, to what's called fast, slow in, slow out. We can also do what's called a stepped tangent, which basically just steps the object between these keys, which is not really what we want. We can also set it to linear, which again is a straight line. So I can right click above this, go it this way, or I can click it in the interface here. So by adjusting curves, we can very finely control the way that the system in-betweens our keyframes. We can set it to something like linear, which is a straight line, or we can use splines to very precisely control our animation curves.